So, a temporary truce in Syria, but Islamic State militants, they won't be included in that truce, and they are particularly powerful also in Iraq. Let's show you the front page of The Independent, a special report looking at the grip that the militants have in the city of Mosul. The paper reports on a new wave of brutality there. It has personal accounts from people who have managed to get away.
Now, of course, the G20 summit kicks off at the end of this week in Shanghai, and the International Money Fund is urging the world's leading economies to band together in a bid to improve global growth. That's the front page of today's Financial Times.
The Wall Street Journal next has Britain's in or out EU vote. It reports that when it comes to political forecasting, investors are looking less at what the polls say, rather more at the odds offered by bookmakers.
The International New York Times is looking at Libya after the fall of dictator Muammar Gaddafi and whether the nation could return to a monarchy as a way to help rebuild itself.
Finally, Gulf News reports that the UAE will introduce a 5% sales tax from 2018. Most of the Gulf states need to broaden their income base as oil continues to fall. And for other reasons as well. And he is the man to explain this, because Oliver Cornock, managing editor at Oxford Business Group, you're a bit of a Middle East expert, so we've chosen some stories that we think you can give us your particular insights on. Let's start with Mosul, because clearly the ceasefire, there's never even been talk of that. Why? Why hasn't there been talk of a ceasefire in Iraq when they're talking about one in Syria? Because there's a war going on in Iraq, isn't there?
I think the simple fact that there's such confusion about where a ceasefire might come from is tantamount to telling us what this story is all about, which is one of chaos and cruelty. And I think that's what this independent feature really shows us, and a classic independent front, isn't it? You know, a big picture of a lady veiled. And I think this story, for me, speaks of a bit of desperation as well, which is that a glimmer of hope? I couldn't say, because actually the barbarity of what ISIS is doing to these women, we're hearing about a clipper device, some sort of barbaric medieval tool that punishes ladies that are not appropriately or deemed appropriately dressed. A constant biting pain, like an animal trap it's described as, worse than labour pangs, some ladies have spoken. So this feature goes through all of these, but one thing that struck me, and again, a tiny glimmer, is that actually suddenly, because the fuel supply has been cut, energy's been cut, people's mobile telephones aren't working, the internet is being very heavily monitored. I'm wondering whether there's the beginnings of people's standard of living being affected to such a degree now that the populace, which has broadly fallen on side with ISIS in the past, the support, remember, was quite significant. Is that waning? I don't know. But we talk of where you started, ceasefires, and, you know, unless you've got the public on side, that's a very difficult sell.
When the Iraq conflict was the main conflict in the Middle East, people were talking about a potential break of the country along ethnic or sectarian lines, and now people are talking about the same in Syria. Do you think that's possible in either country still? Is it a possibility, probability?
Look, you listen to the commentators, and in Iraq is already, the integrity of Iraq is already fractured at best. You have a Shia state in the middle, you know, a Baghdad-Basra line. You have a Sunni whatever on the left, caliphate, whatever you want to call it, and then you have a resurgent Kurdish independence on the eastern side, and that's going to be very unpalatable for a lot of Iraq and Syria's neighbours. So this is not a conflagration that's going to go away anytime soon.
Okay.
We'll return to that subject a bit later in the review, but let's move on to financial elements. And this is the Financial Times front page. The International Monetary Fund, as ever, putting out its stall before a G20 summit. And in this case, it's saying we'd like to see coordinated action between the big economies in the world to tackle the current events, i.e. market volatility, that they say there's real evidence now is affecting the global economy. Your thoughts?
Couldn't agree more, but the question is what could they do? I mean, I don't know, as somebody who looks at this, I just wonder what they could do. And you're right, they're saying strong actions needed, but quite what that is, well, I don't know.
That's exactly what I thought, because it quotes here Jack Lew, who's the US Treasury Secretary, because on Friday it's actually the finance ministers and the central bankers that will be meeting in Shanghai, and the question is kind of pointed in their direction, isn't it? Particularly central bankers, who've always been looked to in this environment to help markets and therefore help the global economy.
Absolutely, but I think central bankers, since the financial crisis, have brought every tool in the box to the front and used it. And then you look, for example, at the UK, suddenly there's a huge amount of pressure on the pound. Currencies are under pressure. Chinese growth central to the story. And for us at Oxford Business Group, emerging market specialists, the emerging markets are really suffering the knock-on effect of the slowdown in these fast, in these major economies.
And add to that the price of oil for some of them as well.
Absolutely.
OK, let me bring up the odds according to one bookmaker who I placed my money with. I won't give you their name. In favour of remaining in the EU, 3-1 on. So you have to bet £3 to win one back, but you'd make more money if you bet on in favour of exiting EU, 9-4. Why would investors be looking at bookmakers' odds rather than what the decision makers are saying?
Well, if you looked at last year's UK general election, there's your answer. And I think
did the bookies get it right then?
Well, the bookies, I think, were nearer to the mark than the pollsters, and that's a serious point, and it's been a big debate. And as we look to the US general election, we're seeing it's very difficult to call. You look at the situation now in the States. Where do you go? There's some very alarming pollster figures coming out now. But back to this story, it really does show how important and all-pervading, I suppose, Brexit is. It's never far from the headlines, as you said, Sam.
Yeah.
It isn't far from the headlines. It's interesting that this is, the Wall Street Journal looking for its angle on Brexit. It's I don't know where in your organisation, if it's that kind of situation where you're thinking, we've got to look at every possible avenue here in the next 4 months.
Well, this is an article citing people from JP Morgan Asset Management. This shows you actually the global implications for this decision, whatever it is. And I think that's very important, especially when we go back to the previous story that sentiment is everything, and especially for the UK economy, not the most robust at the moment, certainly not the least, but very fragile, and sentiment is everything. And I think that's part of this story as well.
I'm trying to think of my history here, Oliver. Was it the 1950s? Gamal Abdel Nasser ousted the monarchy in Egypt. Muammar Gaddafi ousted the monarchy in Libya. And now this article in the International New York Times is saying possibly it might be a good idea to bring back the monarchy in Libya. Why? Well,
this again, I'm afraid, speaks to almost desperation here. What is the answer? Libya, we've got two rival governing factions. We've got a Western support package that's only is contingent on some form of unity government that doesn't seem to be happening. This is a very interesting story, but there is a reason why many of these nationalist movements got rid of monarchies, and to me this just smacks of desperation.
Yeah, but they were supposed to be nationalist movements. They effectively, I think it's fair to say, turned into dictatorships, didn't they? They weren't that nationalist socialist movement of the people in the end.
Very good point.
They were all about one person.
And they became almost dynastic as
well.
Yes, they
exactly.
became so you're right, but I can't see this working, not least because there's no consensus on anything in Libya.
Yeah.
And the other point, just to go there, terrifying though it is, ISIS is flooding into Libya.
Well,
yes.
that was the story we talked
Yep.
about only a few days ago. That
Absolutely.
With all the concentration on Syria, etc., they're moving.
We're seeing
a
mass movement, and also from Africa. We're reading about support coming up from the African continent. That has to be worrying for both the Libyan factions, but also for the West, and puts pressure on this package, some form of aid.
And just briefly, the Gulf News, the situation with the oil price is never far away from their front page for obvious reasons, but now it talks about the fact that in the UAE, they're looking at getting income in through raising value-added tax.
Diversification is the watchword for these Gulf oil-based economies. In the summer, we heard about subsidy reduction, which was very important, something the IMF had been pushing for a very long time, something that commentators like me have been talking about forever.
Subsidy reduction on oil.
On fuel, domestic fuel.
Yeah.
Some of the bills for subsidies are enormous. This is just another step in this road. I think in terms of long-term, really good news, but in terms of the short-term, of course, inevitably a little bit of pain, not least for the private sector.
The best kind of guests are the ones that when they talk, you learn something. Oliver, I'm more educated now than I was 10 minutes ago. Thank you very much indeed. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for coming in, Oliver.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. Have a good day.